entrance. About 70,000 years ago. The gigantic creature inside the cylindrical glass chamber filled with liquid closed its eyes as if trying to enter a kind of trance, slightly opening its arms and joining its fingertips together. After a few seconds, a red shape in the form of a triangle appeared on the forehead of the creature. The shape soon became apparent. It was about time. For too long, he had been treated as an outlaw in this strange prison built by mankind. Pathetics, he thought, they really believe they can keep me locked up here. He concentrated thoroughly. Now he could see clearly. The image of the giant reactor about 50 miles away was inside his head, down to the smallest technical details. Everything was so vivid that he could touch it if he stretched out his hand. What he needed was simple. He scanned his mind. He found the coolant of the atomic reactor built below the water level. He smiled slightly at himself. It was a strange smile. The projects of the channels connecting the cooling pumps to the facility were built on the inaccessible floor of the island in the middle of the ocean with the idea that no external element could interfere. For him it was child's play to do so. It's 5:15 a.m. One of the cooling pumps stopped for no reason. The heat produced by the giant reactor could not reach the coolant. Soon after, the backup cooling system was activated. However, it only took a few seconds for it to be disabled. While all this was happening, interestingly, the alarms did not work. All indicators were normal. Everything was fine for the technical guys in charge of security, who periodically glanced at the monitor. The situation was noticed too late. By the time the monitor signaled that the cooler had gone off as it should, the whole place was already shaking and shaking violently. The old man with long white hair and a white coat, who had worn strange glasses, turned to his younger colleagues and said with a depressed expression, "Mir is no doubt. He did it." "Didn't the shelter area come into play?" said the youngest of the other three men in the room. "It works smoothly," the white-haired man replied. "But it doesn't work." It was obvious that he had difficulty standing up as he spoke. He could predict what was going to happen. "It was a common decision of all of us, Professor. We behaved in the way we believed to be right," said the sparsely-haired blonde in her fies. Me old man did not respond. "Are we going to start the procedure?" the young one asked. He perceived his own voice as if it were someone else speaking. He was numb all over. He still couldn't believe that this day might really have come. He had lost all sense of reality. Me Professor replied to the question with a question. "Does anyone have any other suggestions?" Mir was a short silence. No one responded. Matt wasn't a real question anyway. Me sparsely-haired blonde doctor asked. "To whom will you give the task?" Me Professor pretended to think. "Man. As you know," he said, "there are 3 people who can take on this job, Jacob, Peter, and—" Before the professor could finish speaking, the earth began to shake again and with a greater intensity than the first time, and at the same time it was plunged into complete darkness. Part 1. Washington, D.C., November 2021. Colonel Armstrong finally lied his head from the book in which he had been buried for hours. He stretched open his arms and legs, which had been held from immobility. He rubbed his eyes with 2 fingers. His eyes turned red and the images began to bifurcate. He looked at his watch. 2018. She'll be mad at me again for being late for dinner? He put one of the pens on the table in the inner pocket of his jacket and the others in the pen holder. As he was getting ready to get up, there was a knock on the door. It was David who came. "If there's nothing you want from me, I'm leaving, Mr. Colonel." David Brewster has been by Colonel's side almost from the beginning of his career. A man who was very reliable, mature and free from all ambitions. David had always been with Colonel as a security guard, secretary, driver and sometimes even as a cook, and moreover with his fatherly attitude, he had given useful advice to his younger boss when necessary, supporting him in difficult situations. In this respect, the relationship between them was beyond the relationship of employer to employee. "Of course you can leave, David." Me man in his 60s, was buttoning his coat on one side. "It's late, sir, don't overexert yourself," he blinked vaguely. "I'm getting out now, David." Seeing the sincere smile on Colonel's face, David quietly turned around, closed the door and exited. Colonel, moving slightly to the lee with his swivel chair, stared out the window pensively for a moment. Me weather had cooled down and a light rain had begun. Me young man stood up, put a brace between the books he was working on and closed them. He made his way to the bookcase which covered the entire right wall of his study room. He paused for a moment as if he wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do. He then pulled a small key fob out of the right pocket of his jacket. Leaning slightly, he opened one of the closed eyes at the bottom of the library with a key. He was confronted with a number of meticulously arranged files and a small but intact safe. He carefully opened the safe with the other key on his key fob. There was no money, jewelry, weapons, or any valuables inside the safe. Instead, there was a thick-bound book that at first glance appeared to be quite old. He slowly pulled the book out of the safe. He opened the lid. Everything is where it should be. A fairly determined man, Colonel seemed rather hesitant about what he wanted to do for the day. Finally, he locked the safe, then the closet, and proceeded to the door, grabbed his leather bag from the hanger, and carefully placed the book he was holding in his hand. Perhaps such precaution is unnecessary, I worry, probably in vain. He hung the bag over his lee shoulder, took his coat in the other hand and left the room. He went down the narrow staircase to the large hall with high ceilings that housed thousands of books. He habitually glanced around and headed for the door to see if there was anything missing. He opened the door, which was locked from the outside, with his own key from the inside, went outside. It was really cold. He quickly closed and locked the door. Instead of wasting time putting on his coat, he ran his way to his 1972 Citroën DS21, which he parked in his usual place, just across the street. He got into his car, put his coat in the back seat and his bag in the side seat, and started the engine of his car, which he could not give up using despite the risk of being banned from traffic. He heard the message notification sound coming to his mobile phone. "You're late?" Smiling to himself, he replied, "I'm home for half an hour." When Colonel Armstrong moved to go home, he didn't notice that a pickup truck parked about 5 feet across the street was moving at the same time as him. Part 2. International Institute of General Health and Genome Analysis, Washington, 1989. Dr. Nathan Coleman had had a busy day as usual and was happy to be leaving his office and going home soon. He had devoted years to his profession and was starting to get tired. He was glad that in the near future, 7 months to be exactly, he would retire and enjoy life in the remaining time. He put out his cigarette and closed the paperback file in front of him. He scratched his head lightly with not much hair left. Out of the corner of his eye, he smiled faintly at himself as he looked at the Game Boy he had bought for his granddaughter, who would be 8 years old in 2 days, on the table. How much technology has advanced. The kids now are so lucky. Me playing device, designed by Gunpei Yokoi of the Japanese Nintendo company, was originally obtained by adding the features of the NES game system to a Game & Watch type device, and the device released that year became a complete furor, reaching sales figures above all expectations worldwide. In summary, his grandson would love the game of Tetris. He stood up, took off his white coat and walked up to the sling. At that moment he was startled by the sound of the phone ringing. Saying so, he moved over to the dark green phone on the table, holding up the handset. "I'm Dr. Coleman. Who are you?" The voice from the opposite end was familiar, but such a call was completely unexpected, and hearing it was enough to disturb his peace. "Hi Nathan, I'm Odd. I hope I caught you before you leave the workplace. I'll be there in an hour to talk to you about something. Private?" Sir Odd Maureen, though about 10 years younger than Dr. Coleman, was in a way his supervisor. A few years ago, Sir Maureen was chairman of the Supervisory Council for Genome Research, which oversees many genetic research centers around the world, with its headquarters in London. Such an institution, which may sound strange at first glance, was founded on a general concern about the social and ethical implications of modern genetic technology and first focused on the potential dangers of genetically modified biological weapons in 1983. As a result, some international restrictions were imposed on the issue. The Council, which continued to exist mainly as a formality of sorts, carried out routine inspections at certain times of the year, both of the International Institute for General Health and Genome Analysis under Dr. Coleman and many other similar institutions in various countries of the world. This time, however, it was clear that there was something out of the ordinary. Dr. Nathan Coleman sat down at his desk grunting, lit a cigarette, and waited for his unexpected visitor, turning a pen in his hand nervously. Part 3. Washington, D.C., November 2021. The middle-aged, red-haired man with the dirty beard in the driver's seat was shivering from the cold. Turning to his friend who was sitting next door, he said nervously, "What are you waiting for? Turn on that heater?" His friend glared. "Do you think I didn't try? It's not working, it's broken?" Me red-haired driver grunted and operated the wipers. Me rain was getting heavier. "Damn, look at the car they gave us despite all the means at their disposal." His friend didn't feel the need to answer. "What did you expect? Luckily for us, the task they give us is child's play. This bookworm guy won't even realize what happened to him." Armstrong, who was driving about 100 yards ahead at the same time, veered off a side road about 5 miles after leaving his workplace. Noticing the heavy rain, he reduced his speed a bit and switched on his wipers, as did the driver of the pickup truck, who he was unaware had been following him for about 15 minutes. Immediately after, the pickup truck veered onto the same side road. A little while ago the number of cars between the two vehicles was about 10, but when he did this number decreased to 2. 6 years ago, Colonel opened a large bookstore in Seattle called the Queen's Bookstore. Queen's Bookstore was also a publishing house and printing house. That same year, paying particular attention to the fact that it was as quiet and remote from his workplace as possible, he bought his house, built in the shed style, in a large garden located in a large garden, near the town of Ellicott City, 39 miles from Washington, D.C., about 10 miles from the center of the town. There was a distance of 30 miles between his workplace and his home, and 5 miles of this distance had been covered in the city, the rest continued in a forested area that had become quite desolate and narrow in places. Van continued its pursuit, maintaining a distance of several more miles and being careful not to attract attention. Driver gestured, slightly raising his lee hand. Here, the sharp intersection 100 meters ahead. Get ready? His friend coldly put his hand on the Springfield XDM 4.5-inch assassination weapon. As soon as they reached the intersection, the van increased its speed. Within seconds, Colonel instinctively realized that something was wrong. Vehicle, which he did not understand where it came from behind him, suddenly approached him and almost put his nose against the back of his car. Damn, I didn't expect it to be this early. He tried to get away by increasing his speed, but that seemed unlikely. Headlights of the vehicle behind him were catching his eyes, and the heavy rain made it difficult for him to move the way he wanted. Pickup truck suddenly swerved to the lee, picking up its speed even further, appearing in the lee lane in the blink of an eye, right next to Colonel's vehicle. Assassin in the right seat began to open the glass of his door with his right hand. As he was about to point the gun he was holding in his lee hand at the driver of the vehicle next to him, he was startled by his friend's voice. Lower the gun, something is wrong. His friend replied, What the hell are you talking about? Do what I tell you. Tonight it went to bed, he said, overtaking the vehicle next to him, crossing into the right lane and continuing on his way as if nothing had happened. Floundering on the slippery road, Colonel suddenly broke the steering wheel to the right and hit the brakes hard to avoid hitting the vehicle in front of him. Vehicle slid around its axis, turning 360 degrees. His right side lifted up slightly as if he was about to do a somersault. But he didn't. Finally he stopped. Apparently there was no damage to the vehicle or the Colonel. Young man took a deep breath. He pulled his car to the side of the road to take a breather and recover. Despite the continued rainfall, he got out of the vehicle and needed fresh air. There was no sign of the pickup truck. Maybe it has nothing to do with me, it's just a drunken tramp. A few seconds later, he heard the siren of an ambulance approaching from the opposite direction. Immediately afterwards, the ambulance drove past the Colonel at full speed. 2 minutes earlier, the red-haired driver had abandoned tonight's operation on the deserted road, where rain had blocked his view, thinking that the overhead light of the ambulance, which he had vaguely noticed, might have belonged to the police vehicle. 5 minutes later, Colonel Armstrong set out for the second time that evening to reach his home, 10 minutes away. Part 4. 1967. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings over there? In the darkest days of the Cold War, when the dates showed January 1967, the USSR had proved to the world that it was far ahead of the United States in the space race, and it continued to reinforce this with its new experiments. Of course, this situation was not acceptable to the U.S. government. 3 years before the end of President Kennedy's 10-year deadline for the moon landing, NASA was still far behind schedule. A team of about 400,000 people was trying to prepare for flight the massive Saturn V rocket, which would carry 3 astronauts to the moon and had never been seen before. Location: the American Cape Canaveral Space Base, Florida. Day and night work and testing continued apace 7 days a week. Command Module and Service Module, which are the most important parts of the program, and the Lunar Module, which will land the astronauts on the lunar surface, which is perhaps the most difficult part of the job, were subjected to endless tests with a great rush. Mission's commander was Virgil Gus Grissom, a highly experienced staff member who had actually been on space missions before. He was to make this test flight, scheduled for January 27, 1967, with colleagues Edward White and Roger Chaff. Main purpose of the planned flight was to prepare Apollo 1 for launch, which was supposed to take place on February 21, 1967. Gus, however, was not very peaceful. Preparations for such an important task were too loud for him. When Gus and his team first inspected the spacecraft, he panicked. Everywhere was covered with bum cables hanging down from everywhere. And he wasn't the only one who thought this way. John Young, a close friend and valued NASA employee, shared the same concern and warned Gus about it days before the launch. Gus said helplessly at John's warning, "I know, but if he tells people that air this minute, all they're going to do is fire me," he said. January 26, 1967, 4:17 a.m. Two shadows quietly floated under the launch pad. One of the men was carrying a small backpack. The other looked up at the massive Saturn 1B rocket and the Apollo 1 capsule fixed on it. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Instead of answering, his friend vaguely moved his head. He then began to climb into the giant capsule to reach the command module. Mean task, every detail of which had been worked out in advance, was completed before half an hour was up. Command module was to be tested entirely using its own means. It would use its own electricity, its own fuel, and its own oxygen. Test, which would be carried out completely independently of the control center, was called wireless. Astronauts would be locked in a cabin filled with pressurized pure oxygen. January 27, 1967. It's 11:30 and 54 seconds p.m. After hours of testing, communication with an intermediate module was completely lost. He said over the radio, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings over there?" An announcement was heard. While the astronauts were waiting for radio communication to reappear, sparks scattered from an exposed cable beneath Gus and quickly caught fire due to pressurized oxygen. Immediately afterwards there was a very violent explosion. People who rushed to help were thrown back by the force of the explosion, while others were unable to approach the module due to toxic gases and high temperatures. After a long struggle, the bulky cover of the module could be opened, but the job was done and the team was already lost. Crew members Virgil Gust Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee were honored as martyrs by the U.S. government and an official ceremony was held. Part 5. Washington, D.C., November 2021. Colonel Armstrong was in front of his house a little less than 10 minutes later, this time without any problems. Selena, who seemed to feel that there was something wrong, greeted her husband by going out into the garden before there was a knock on the door. Colonel hugged his wife lightly and kissed her. "I was starting to wonder about you. Is everything okay?" Colonel looked tired and pensive looking. "Nothing important, darling. Don't worry, please. Let's go inside and we'll talk in a moment." Old leather bag hanging over her husband's shoulder did not escape Selena's attention. Once inside, Colonel hurriedly went to the bathroom, telling her that she needed to take a shower without taking the bag off her shoulder. 15 minutes later, the headache that had been going on for some time had subsided and he was a little relieved, sitting in the kitchen with his coffee cup in his hand and talking to his wife. "I had a minor car accident, but nothing major," Selena said in a daze. "Accident? Why didn't you say it earlier?" "We have to go to the hospital immediately," he said. With as calm and reassuring a face and demeanor as possible, Colonel said, "Darling, this isn't really necessary. I'm fine. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Selena, whose face was yellowed, was looking at her husband with worried eyes with a glass of water in her hand. "Of course. Only a few drunken tramps suddenly pinched me. They had some fun in their own way and walked away. That's when I suddenly braked and slipped a little on the road. That's all. I didn't hit any of my parts and there is no damage to the car." Selena finished the water in her glass and left it on the table. She hugged her husband. "Are you sure that's all?" Colonel couldn't answer for a while. Averting his eyes, he was able to say vaguely, "Sure. I hope that's really all." Selena was restless, though calm. She had married her husband knowing who he was. He was aware that he was afraid of certain things in his past or that there were some things that could not be changed. He did not prolong the subject. They spent that evening a little quieter than usual but casually. When they retired to their bedroom in the middle of the night, Colonel's words caused Selena to not be able to sleep until the morning. "Selena, tonight's accident. It may not be as simple as it seems. If anything happens to me in the coming days, you can find the answers in the book in my leather bag." Part 6. Florida, May 1969. A very private speech was being held at the NASA flight executive's president's home. "As I said, Neil, the launch will be held on July 16th as planned, but some details will be slightly different from what will be released to the press. You already know these things. I'm hosting you tonight because I'm going to make a strange-sounding request to you and Michael and Edwin." First man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong, commander of Apollo 11, knew that although he did not know what this request was, it would be more of an order than a request. "Can you be more specific, sir?" "Of course. Before the actual journey takes place, we will shoot a simulation of the moon landing in a studio that we have prearranged to be given to the press on the return journey." Armstrong looked confused. "I don't quite understand, sir." Are you saying that you will actually go to the moon, but still take fake images? In fact, the astronaut's reaction wasn't as violent as the president expected. Yes, you certainly got it right, Neil, but let's not call him a fake if you like. Armstrong dropped the glass in his hand onto the table and slightly loosened his collar. So why are we doing this, sir? The reason is simple, the president said. If what we hope to find on the moon is really there, then we'd like people to think that this journey isn't real. These statements were not even close to being an explanation for Neil. Has he been drinking too much lately? Forgive me, sir, but... The president continued, without allowing the astronaut to finish his speech. If you're asking how people are going to think that such a journey wasn't made when you're actually going to go to the moon and artificial images have been taken about it, the answer is simple. Camera recordings of the actual journey will not be leaked to the press, while studio recordings will show the American flag planted on the lunar surface waving in the wind. Now everything was falling into place in Neil's head. With the excitement of the event, it would escape the public eye that it was impossible for a flag to fly on the lunar surface. The moon had no atmosphere, but after a while this detail would begin to make sense. But what if we're wrong about what we think is on the moon? What are we going to do, sir? The president looked at Neil with an expressionless face. Simple, then we release the actual footage. This was an answer that the astronaut had more or less been waiting for. But he didn't like all that. Of course, sir. Part 7. 1989. The black limousine Maureen was stopped in front of the Institute for Genome Analysis exactly 1 hour after the phone call. However, only Maureen's private driver got out of it. The driver made his way to the main entrance gate of the large building, which was built in the 60s. The middle-aged security guard assigned to the vigil had been briefed by Dr. Coleman of the unusual visit. But the guard was puzzled to realize that the driver, who was advancing towards him with quick steps, was alone. "Hello, I guess you're Sir Maureen's chauffeur?" Me driver nodded in agreement indifferently. "All right, Dr. Coleman is waiting for Sir Maureen in his room." Me driver, with an arrogant grin on his face, stared at the security guard and said, "No. The meeting will not be held here. Sir Maureen is waiting for Dr. Coleman in his car." The watchman, red out of surprise and weariness, said, "But how?" But Maureen's driver, without waiting for the guard to finish his sentence, quietly turned around and drove toward the limousine parked 50 yards away. Part 8. Washington, D.C., November 2021. Colonel Armstrong's insatiable curiosity had in recent years made the young man obsessed with the original manuscripts on subjects he was interested in. This time what he was after were some additional manuscripts that were not found in the known version of the New Atlantis, written by Francis Bacon in 1626. His long-standing contact had given him more or less confidence. There seemed to be a possibility that the manuscripts he claimed to have in his possession were real. Colonel Armstrong was ready to meet face-to-face with his connection in Georgetown, taking a plane journey of about 1,400 miles, for such a possibility. At 6:30 a.m., Ronald Reagan hurriedly packed breakfast to catch his flight from Washington National Airport and leave his home around 3:50 a.m. Instead of getting into his private car, he called a taxi, and 10 minutes later he appeared in front of the taxi door. About 10 kilometers later, the car began to shake slightly. Colonel, who had begun to doze off in the back seat, woke up startled. "What's going on?" Me taxi driver took off his hat, put it on the side seat, turned around and said with a cold expression, "I hope you have an extra half hour, sir. I think I'll have to change the tire. I'm afraid I have to ask you to get out of the car and wait outside while you're doing this." Colonel opened the car door in despair and hoping not to miss the plane. He hadn't gotten off yet, but the taxi driver's facial expression intuitively gave the impression that something was wrong with him. At the same time, he attempted to close the door he had opened, but it was too late. In a nimble motion, the driver grabbed the rear door of the car hard with his left hand, preventing it from closing, while quickly pulling out his right hand, which he had tucked into his jacket pocket. The last thing Colonel saw in this world, while he was still fully conscious, would be the thin syringe that the dull-looking cabbie was holding, which was obviously prepared in advance, and the colorless liquid inside. He felt a sharp pain in his right shoulder. Within seconds, his breath began to shorten, his eyes began to darken, and his chest began to tighten. He was dizzy and sweating. His journey in this world had been shorter than he deserved. About 15 minutes later, the taxi driver who rushed to rush his passenger, who had an unexpected heart attack, to the hospital, unfortunately did not manage to save his life despite all his efforts. Part 9. Washington, D.C., December 2021. Selena Dale Armstrong was a strong woman. Nearly a month had passed since his wife's suspicious death. The cause of death was recorded as a heart attack, and after routine examinations and procedures were carried out, the young man was quietly buried and life returned to normal for everyone. But Selena believed that the reality was different. After his death, she told the police about his uneasy attitudes and suspicions before his wife's death and insisted that the incident be investigated. Each time this request was passed over by the police. For Selena, who is a prudent person, it didn't take long to realize that normal legal processes would not yield results. Selena was startled that day when she was slowly losing hope that the incident might come to light. Oh my God, how stupid I am. All this time that Colonel said the night of his car accident was completely out of her mind. Part 10. Washington, D.C., 1989. Dr. Coleman was having an interesting conversation with Sir Maureen inside the limousine in West Potomac National Park outside the city. What does all this mean, Odd? Why did you hurry me here? Maureen grinned wickedly with her big mouth. He didn't deign to answer Coleman's question. How long have we been working with you, Nathan? Coleman looked blankly and chattered. For years. Have you ever wondered why? Coleman didn't seem to quite understand the question. Why? Are we talking about a special reason? I am a specialist in molecular biology and genetics. My successful work and competence in this field are obvious. Me Institute for Genome Analysis needed someone like me who could take charge of things. I applied for the job and... Maureen interjected with a laugh. That's not how it works, man. It's true that we need someone like you, but not for the reasons you think. Every scientist handles the technical aspect of the work in more or less the same way. That's not what we needed. Coleman looked at it as if to say, so what was it? But he didn't say anything. Maureen continued. Remember your article published in The Economist in the 70s? Yes, of course. But there I made only a sociological observation. Wasn't directly related to my expertise. That's exactly what it's about. You are a complete conservative about the system and order. You lack the creativity to perceive everything except what you see with your own eyes and what your elders have taught you as a threat to the system, and to call it nonsense, my friend. Mischaracteristic was immediately apparent from what he wrote in The Economist. You were talking about how the rabble, as you call it, which deals with alternative medicine, space exploration and conspiracy theories, is a poison for the social order and scientific reason. That's what we needed. Your narrow-mindedness and commitment to the system. How's that? According to you, history is as it is told to us in schools, the news we watch on television is impartial, the social order is unshakable, everything we do not hold with our hands is nonsense, and those who are engaged in other things are either foolish or fraudulent. How exactly did this feature of mine work for you? Simply put, we can easily manipulate you. You were doing things the way you should without being afraid of being suspicious of certain things, getting out of your mouth, or trying to take advantage of certain situations. So what's changed this time? What has changed this time is this. If you don't know more or less about the background of the project ahead, you can't run the business. Now open your ears and listen carefully to what I have to say, Nathan. Maureen spoke for quite some time. Much of what he said was contrary to all of Dr. Coleman's knowledge and beliefs. Coleman. It seems like it's going to take me a while to get what you're saying together in my head and put it in place. Odd. If what you say is true, then all of humanity is living in a kind of boast. It is beyond me to understand why this is necessary and how it is achieved. I'm not sure I want to know. You just need to know that much, my friend. I'm not authorized to explain too much anyway, and even if I did, I don't think he would believe it at this stage. Even a smart man like you has to go through some stages to be able to handle it beyond that. That's not the point anyway. What do you say about what I want from you? It gets on my nerves, Odd, that you act like I have a choice but to grant your request. As you can imagine, the employees of the Institute will not like the fact that the working areas will be occupied in a way. Nevertheless, all the physical facilities of the Institute will be at your disposal for studies on the date you specify. On the other hand, although I am not quite convinced of the truth of much of what you say tonight, for a man like me, who has devoted 40 years of his life to scientific work, the experiment you are talking about is extremely exciting. Odd. Maureen was content to grin. He gestured to the limousine's driver, who had been waiting in the driver's seat separated by soundproof glass for about an hour, to move. Part 11. Washington, D.C., December 2021. Selena was amazed at how she had forgotten all this time what her husband had said about the book and the bag he had brought home the night of the car accident. She carefully lowered down an oil painting hanging on the wall of her living room. When she took down the painting, a quality reproduction by the British painter George Stubbs, from the wall, a steel case appeared embedded in the wall, hidden behind it. She opened the safe by entering her password. She took out the leather bag inside, opened it carefully, and was surprised to see the old book. The Bible? Is this a joke? Selina had no idea how to find an answer to what happened in this book, which at first glance seemed like an ordinary Bible. She slowly and carefully turned the pages one by one. A few seconds later, the truth was revealed. The middle of the book had been cut out to form a square chamber. A newspaper page from about 3 years ago was folded into it. The Washington Post, January 12, 2019. Selina opened the newspaper page, which was folded several times and turned into a square of about 10 by 10 centimeters. A particular story was surrounded by a red ballpoint pen, and the headline of the same story was crossed out in yellow highlighter. Lecturer Simon Blake and suspended Major Boris Pavlov have solved the spontaneous human combustion case, shedding light on the mysterious deaths. Boris Pavlov has been reinstated. Association Professor Dr. Simon Blake has been awarded the Achievement Award by the Academic Board of the University of Washington. And in the upper left corner of the story, framed in red ballpoint, was written "Ask David" in Colonel's obvious handwriting. Selina, with newsprint in her hand, sat down on one of the seats in the living room. She took a deep breath. Her pensive gaze locked into the garden for a while. She hoped she would find more understandable answers. She had no idea who Simon Blake or Boris Pavlov was. As for the phenomenon of spontaneous combustion, she vaguely remembered watching a documentary during her student years. But she had no idea what connection that might have to with what had happened. The phrase that seemed most understandable to him was "Ask David," which Colonel wrote in his own handwriting. David was a common name, and there were probably many people Colonel knew by that name. However, Colonel did not specify a last name, and a note to his wife likely did so because he thought it would already be clear who he meant: David Brewster. Selina gathered her head and tried to decide what to do. If there's anything to be learned from David, why didn't he come and tell me spontaneously after all the time that has passed since Colonel's death? David was more of a close friend to Selina than to Colonel, and he was severely shaken by Colonel's death. But he didn't give Selina any explanation. Maybe he has to wait for me to ask for some reason I don't know right now. Or he simply forgot, like me. Selina stood up. She probed the pockets of his pants. My phone. She looked around. She saw the cell phone she had left on the big table in the living room. Without letting go of his newspaper leaf, she moved forward and picked up her phone. She found David's number. Ere a pause, she gave up searching. Putting the phone in her pocket, she headed for the bedroom where he had left her laptop.